Hello everyone, welcome back to VLGA Connect, brought to you by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. Each week we bring you the latest news, some interviews and discussions on the issues of importance and interest to the local government sector in Victoria. And we have much to talk about this week. Tony Raunic will be my only guest. We have some stories to unpack. The voiding of an election at Whittlesea Council, which is prompting a by-election, and the suspension of the Mayor of Baw Baw Shire this week after an arbitration ruling. More on that coming up very soon. But right now, let's catch up on the headlines in Connect News. In breaking news this morning, the Victorian Parliament has passed a controversial new Emergency Services and Volunteers Fund that will replace the existing Fire Services Levy. Property owners face significant tax increases as a result, which will be charged on council rate notices. Many of the state's councils had opposed the new levy, along with farmer and firefighter groups, with farmers facing up to 150% increases in their payments. Whittlesea City Council is down to 9 councillors after VCAT voided the result of the council's Layla Ward election. The council announced last Friday that it noted the decision and findings of attempted and actual interference in the election, the outcome being that Stephen Kosmeski no longer holds the office of councillor with immediate effect. There's been no suggestion of any wrongdoing on the part of Mr Kosmeski. A by-election will be held on the 2nd of August, and Mr Kosmeski has indicated that he intends to recontest. A by-election in Darebin City Council will also be held on that date to fill the vacancy created by the recent passing of Gaetano Greco. Baw Baw Shire Mayor Danny Goss has been suspended for 21 days by an arbiter who found that he'd breached standards of conduct during the previous council term. Councillor Goss had apologised publicly, saying he regretted comments made when he lost his temper in an acrimonious council debate. The arbiter said if not for that apology, she would have applied the maximum 28-day suspension allowed. More on that story and the Whittlesea situation coming up with Tony Raunic very shortly. Golden Plains Shire Councillor Sarah Hayden has announced her resignation as mayor, citing the need to make space for other leaders and the toll that recent events have taken on her health. She will continue to serve as a councillor, and the council has called an unscheduled meeting for next Tuesday morning to elect its new mayor. Former Whittlesea Council CEO and ex-Victoria Police Chief Commissioner Simon Overland has come out of retirement, joining Moonee Valley City Council's senior executive team. The council confirmed to the Local Government News Roundup this week that Mr Overland has commenced in the role of Director of Strategy, Planning and Climate Resilience. Mr Overland announced his retirement from Burnie City Council in June last year, finishing as that council's General Manager in November after 4 years. The Essential Services Commission has approved Hepburn Council's application for a 7% rate cap variation. The approval, combined with the Victorian Government's 3% cap, will result in a total rate increase of 10% for the coming financial year. The increase is projected to generate an additional $1.36 million in revenue for essential services and infrastructure. The ESC is yet to rule on a higher rate application made by Indigo Shire Council. And briefly in other news this week, Marybeck Council has voted to trial 30 km/h speed limits in select areas of Coburg, Brunswick and Brunswick East. The council will seek approval and funding from the state government for the trial. Yarra City Council has decided not to return the vandalised Captain Cook Memorial to Edinburgh Gardens in Fitzroy due to concerns about repair costs and potential future damage. Mayor Stephen Jolly said it was an economic rather than ideological decision. And the City of Casey is reopening its public gallery at council meetings from next week. A new pre-registration process has been implemented, requiring attendees to register online and bring identification, with a limit of 80 registrations available. That's Connect News for this week. More next week here on VLGA Connect. This week we're going to spend some time with Tony Raunic from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, our terrific sponsors here at VLGA Connect, because we've got a bit to talk about. Hello, Tony. How are you this week?
Very well, Chris. Good to be back. But yeah, real sort of swathe of council matters have come in, both
Yes.
for me as files, but just in the media and being discussed widely across the sector this week.
I know your phone's been running hot about a few things. I want to come to the Emergency Services Levy Fund before we wrap up. That's news that's just coming through as we record that it's passed the Parliament. We'll have a think about implications there because we know a lot of councils have been campaigning against that unsuccessfully, as it turns out. But last week, when we were chatting, after we'd gone to print, if I can say that, when we'd finalised our show, we got the news that VCAT had voided the Layla Ward election in Whittlesea Council, which means a by-election is going to be required. This, of course, dates back to last year, Tony, when the VEC detected what they thought was some suspicious ballot activity, correct?
That's right. That's right. So what they found is basically double voting. The same registered voter having voted twice, which made
Mm.
them suspect that there perhaps been some ballot papers stolen, maybe removed from letterboxes, and then the actual voter has then gone and got a replacement ballot paper and voted as well. So the number of multiple returns, as they call it, in that Laylaw ward was of such a degree that it led to VEC investigating and ultimately have determined that, given the suspected fraud, that there'll need to be a postal by-election. So Councillor Stephen Kosmevsky, who was elected and declared elected previously, he now no longer holds council office. He's eligible, of course, to run in that postal by-election. And we should say there's no suggestion by VEC that he or any other particular candidate was involved in this fraud, which is being referred to the local government inspectorate and police. But what it means, Chris, is there's only now, of the 11 potential councillors or the 11 councillors
Mm.
elected in November of 2024, there's only 9 sitting councillors in Whittlesea now, with the mayor, of course, suspended. And now we await the outcome of this by-election. And in the meantime, we don't have a specific representative for the Laylaw ward. And I guess it's also potentially foreshadowing what might happen in Knox City Council in the Baird ward, where there's a separate investigation there in relation to suspicious returns in the most recent elections as well.
Yeah, so the VEC did say that that matter is still under consideration by VCAT, so we waited a determination there. I think the numbers at Whittlesea, Tony, were 81 suspicious ballots and the margin was 39 votes, so VCAT was satisfied that the outcome could have turned on those particular ballot papers.
Yeah, it suggests to me that there's perhaps how this behind the scenes, how this works, and this is understandable, but there's probably some tolerance level that
Mm.
VEC operate. Maybe 6, 7, 8, 10 multiple returns is obviously disappointing, but not something that necessarily will lead to an election being overturned. In this case, as you point out, Chris, it was a tight vote in a relatively tight vote to determine the outcome in Laylaw Ward, and these suspicious returns would have had an impact on the result.
Mm.
It's not the first time we've seen this. You and viewers will recall what happened in Marybeck Council after the 2020 elections, in that there was a similar investigation into a unusual number of multiple returns, duplicate votes. Police and the VEC got involved then and discovered that some original ballot papers had been stolen. Um, and a former councillor, Milad El Halabi, ultimately pleaded guilty to some vote tampering and was handed a very substantial fine and a community work order.
Yeah.
So these things do occur. I guess what is heartening for all of us is to know that there are investigations and there are measures that actually track these suspicious voting, and we've got an outcome here. And unfortunately, the vote is going to have to go back. It's going to presumably cost that council
Yeah.
the cost of an additional by-election, which is very disappointing. But I think this is a necessity in a democracy. We want to have confidence that those people that elect us have been elected with an appropriate um, ballot that has been fair and equal, and there's been no unreasonable distortion of that.
Yeah, so as you say, no suggestion of any fraud involvement by Mr. Kosmeski or any of the other candidates. He has, according to media reports, indicated that he will be recontesting for that by-election. And you make a good point about the cost, because the council will have to wear that cost, and that's I'm only guessing here. It's going to be in the tens of thousands of dollars at least to run that by-election. And remember, with Aidan McClendon stood aside by the minister and a commission of inquiry coming, there's going to be significant cost there too that the council will have to bear.
Yes, well, and one would think they've already incurred costs in relation to, lawyers and such along the way already. So yeah, a lot of governance costs for Whittlesea Council already this term. Makes me wonder, Chris, is there a better voting solution? And I've got to admit, I couldn't think of
Yeah.
one. I mean, I
Mm.
thought of some options. I mean, this, going back to a mandated um, attendance voting arrangement. I just think we've really moved beyond that. We look at, the recent federal election, the huge number of people that went down that postal voting path. Um, then there's, in other countries, we've seen digital voting systems. They are prone to allegations of abuse too, and I guess there's also a sense that we might disenfranchise some people who aren't as perhaps
Yeah.
digitally literate.
Mm.
But nonetheless, I mean, we'll have people no doubt looking at the voting systems across the country, and is there a better way?
Yeah, discussion for another day, perhaps. All right, so that's the Whittlesea situation. As you say, there's that one on foot in Knox, which we're yet to get a determination on from VCAT. The other big story this week, Tony, was an arbiter's decision tabled at Baw Baw Shire Council. This relates to allegations of conduct in the previous term of council brought by three now former councillors against Danny Goss, who wasn't the mayor then, but is the mayor now. And as a result of this process, is now suspended for 21 days.
Yeah,
Uh, let's unpack this.
well, it is interesting, as you say, Chris, given that time frame, because of course the alleged misconduct or misbehavior has to be judged by the then standards of conduct, as they were called, that applied then, and of course any sanction has to be the sanction that applied at the time the behavior took place. So we've since had those reforms late last year, but these the allegations of misconduct against councillor Goss arise in relation to incidents from March to June of 2024, so prior to those Local Government Act reforms coming in. And they relate to behaviour at three meetings. One was a councillor only meeting, and two were actual council meetings. And there was some delay in the matters being heard. I gather there was a change of arbiter. I think there was some illness involved and such. So that's ultimately the decision was made by Lily O'Neill as arbiter only earlier this month, Chris.
Mm.
But so the behaviour complained of, you have a councillor only meeting in March 2024. Councillors were discussing a greenfield development in Druin, and Councillor Goss, it agreed evidence that Councillor Goss had said to the then Mayor Councillor McCabe at the meeting, the voters in Druin would come after her with baseball bats about a policy position she was taking. Now, Councillor McCabe took that as that comment as a threat against her. Councillor Goss said he wasn't physically threatening Councillor McCabe. He was using a colloquialism and not to be taken literally. The arbiter accepted Councillor Goss's evidence that he wasn't physically threatening Councillor McCabe, but he also found that that comment was delivered in a nasty and aggressive manner that breached the standards of conduct.
Mm.
There was another allegation that was substantiated at the Arbiter hearing, and that was that at a meeting, a council meeting in April, there was a quite a involved and fiery session, I think it was described as, where there was debate about place naming and council's policy for gender equity in place names. And the Arbiter found that generally Councillor Goss's behaviour during the debate didn't breach the standards, but there was a period of time where um, his conduct was abusive and threatening. And again, he was found guilty of misconduct there. There was a third allegation in relation to the council meeting in June. Council was discussing a feasibility study on whether to establish new committees on equity and inclusion. And Councillor Goss said in debate, he said that the councillors in favour of the motion should stick to the knitting. The applicants called the phrase misogynistic and disrespectful. The Arbiter accepted Councillor Goss's evidence that it was the expression was a colloquialism, meant that the committees were outside the remit of council. Council should stick to its usual matters, not go outside its remit. And in relation to that comment, the councillor said there was no breach of the standards. Chris, what's also interesting here is that Councillor Goss made a public and unreserved apology in March of this year. It was published on his Facebook page. It was reported in the local paper. Now, the matter proceeded because at least one of the applicants didn't accept that the apology should put an end to the matter and felt it was inadequate. But importantly, the Arbiter found that the apology was meaningful and sincere, and therefore the councillor ought not be suspended for the maximum period, which was 1 month. Of course, we're talking about the previous sanctions, would now
28
be
days.
3 months under the current regime. So what I'd say is that the implications are that unreserved and sincere apologies will generally be meaningful in determination of sanctions, but won't necessarily mean there's no sanction.
Yeah.
And that's what's occurred here. And I think that we can assume that if there wasn't that unreserved and sincere apology, then there would likely have been the maximum sanction here. And councils ought to be aware of that under the new regime where the sanctions are much higher.
Some observations here, Tony, I've been interested in your thoughts on. One being the time it's taken to get to this point. The incidents, for want of a better word, occurred, as you say, around March to June last year. We've got a decision here in May the following year. One of the issues with this whole system is the time it takes to deal with these issues, isn't it? Which is, it's not fair on anyone.
That's correct. And look, I do think there might have been some extraordinary things here. As I say, it was originally with a different arbiter. I'm not unclear on why there was a change of arbiter, but clearly that would cause some delays. I'm unclear on who.
But notwithstanding that, we've seen similar cases where we haven't had those sorts of things going on, and they've still taken an inordinate number of months to resolve.
I agree with that, and there needs to be, I think, a couple of things. I think that firstly, the internal resolution procedures of council. So each council should have its own internal resolution policy before things go out to an arbiter. And there should be some strict timelines there to encourage councillors to act promptly to try and resolve things internally, rather than that be a reason for delay in terms of a referral to an arbiter. And then I agree that this perhaps in my observation, I've sometimes seen this scenario where there's a directions hearing initially, and the arbiter says, "Oh, who's going to be ready to have a hearing on such and such date?" And everyone, people are very difficult to in terms of finding room in their diaries, and I think essentially this should be seen as a priority for the
Yeah.
councillors involved, and the fact that there might be, other meetings or other commitments in their diary, they perhaps might need to shift in
Yeah.
order to resolve these matters, because I think there's a
Mm.
broader public interest in having them
Yeah.
resolved promptly.
My other thought reading through this, Tony, is the incidents occurred mid last year. The apology came late March this year. What conclusions should we draw from the timing of that apology? Because we're well down the path when that gets made.
Oh, look, I don't doubt that apologies are risen. And in fact, I think there's some suggestion in the arbiter decision that apology has arisen as once this current arbiter has been working through the process with individuals, may well have suggested the value in an apology to
Mm.
the councillor concerned. Although, I must say, Councillor Goss said it was his own decision to make the apology, and the arbiter said it was sincere and meaningful. But yes, I guess, expect that an apology delivered more closely to the time of the offending comments would be particularly meaningful as well.
I guess that's the point I'm making, and it's worth going to the recording of the council meeting from this week to hear Councillor Goss's comments at the end of the meeting in his mayoral minute segment. And the other observation here, Tony, when you read through all of the behaviour that's being described, the complaints that have been made, yes, some of it's been upheld. Some of it has been described as reasonable and in the robust discussion that happens around council chambers, but it's clearly a body of evidence that demonstrates a dysfunctional working relationship between that group of councillors at a point in time.
Yeah. Oh, look, there's no doubt that was the case in Baw Baw, and there's been a substantial change to representation there. Not only those applicant councillors no longer on the council, but various other long-term councillors who might have had different opposing views to those applicants aren't on either. So I think there's a significant change in the politics on that council, but there was persistent issues.
Yeah.
To be fair,
Mm.
in terms of the relationships between councillors in the prior term.
All right, another instructive document there, that arbiter's decision. But as you point out, under the old regime that was changed with the new legislation later in 2024. Tony, before we wrap up, as I mentioned earlier, as we record today, the news has come through that in a late night sitting of the Victorian Parliament, the new Emergency Services Fund has been passed. It's going to replace the levy that's been appearing on council rate notices with a new tax. Um, Quite collectively across the sector and in the farming community and the firefighting community, there's been strong opposition to this. Those efforts have been obviously without success with this new legislation passed today. I guess councils now have to think about their role in this, because they're going to have to put this on rate notices. People are going to react in various ways towards their local councils, aren't they?
Yeah, look, can I just more broadly? I think it's problematic, and I think quite um, cynical is probably not the word, but for other levels of government, in this case the state government, to get local government to be the collector of their taxes and
Mm.
charges, and therefore face the opprobrium, the angst, the anger of their communities. To me seems an unfair. And in this case, um, what will occur on many instances, I think, is people will receive their rate notice and add up the total figure, which is rates, charges, and these levies, which don't go to council, which council has to remit to the state government, and go, oh my God, look at my council rates. The council are charging me X thousand dollars. And so again, like I say, council will face, some of that, much of
Mm.
that criticism for collecting something that they're obliged to collect by legislation. So I don't like that, and I think that there are certainly ways the state government can collect these sorts of levies directly. like they collect land tax and these sorts of things. So the decision now, as you say, there's a whole batch of councils, a large proportion of councils across the state who have who don't support this new levy.
I think
Um,
there were 17 that submitted motions to the MAV State Council, which is on today as we record this, which are now pretty much redundant.
Yeah, and that's a very large
Mm,
proportion because I would think that there would be, beyond those 17, there would be quite a number of councils that are still perturbed by it.
yeah.
So then they certainly, I think, have an obligation under the legislation to uh, seek to collect the levy. The question is, if an individual ratepayer pays the rates and not the levy, what does council do? And I think
Mm,
under the Local Government Act 1989, I think it's section 172, and that's a section that still applies now. And despite the operation of the 2020 Act, those 89 provisions are saved and apply. Council can charge interest,
mm.
not only on rates, but also on charges. And I think levies are in the nature of those charges. And so, do council collect interest on, monies that
Yeah.
ultimately are going to get remitted to the state government? They have the ability to do that, but do they? And where does that interest go? And I think there'll be some sort of contemplation among finance officers at councils and some decisions made across the sector soon. It'll be interesting to
Yeah.
see what that perhaps that body of finance officers' name escapes me, but the CEO
Yeah,
at
I was just going to say, FinPro. It'd be
FinPro, yeah.
interesting to see whether FinPro has a position on that, because I'm guessing from what you're saying, those 89 provisions,
Mm.
they would not have envisaged back then a tax of this type being imposed at the state level on council rate notices, would they?
Well, I think we've had them in the past, but I remember the bushfire levy notice. I think we had at one stage, and I think
Right.
we've had, so I'm not quite sure when the relevant provision came in '89. But you're right, Chris. I mean, I don't. I think this, you know, this, as I've said, this, collecting elements of the state budget through council rates and collections to me is not appropriate, and it seems to me to be a way to kind of the state government to collect some more money and perhaps avoid some of that public angst and have that angst directed at another level of government, in this case local government,
Yeah.
completely unfairly, I would think.
All right, stay tuned. I suspect we'll be talking more about that in the not too distant future as this news permeates. Tony, always great to chat. There's a lot happening at the moment. I think last week we said we'll talk to you perhaps in the next few weeks. Didn't expect to be back with you this week, but who knows what happens next week? We might be talking to you again very soon.
Thanks, Chris. Who knows?
Indeed. Tony Raunic from Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, our sponsors, with us here on VLGA Connect this week. Now, before I leave you, I want to give a plug for next week's Global Executive Live panel. It's coming up on the 22nd of May. That's Thursday, starting at 5:30 Australian Eastern Standard Time. The topic here is civility in public life. It's a topic we've been spending quite a bit of time on in recent months. And gosh, we've got a great panel that's been put together here. The VLGA and LGIU have done an amazing job bringing together this panel, which includes Professor Catherine Needham, the Professor of Public Policy and Public Management at the University of Birmingham in the UK. We have Joe Miller, who's the Chief Executive of Hutt City Council, New Zealand. Diane Kaelin Sukra, the founder of the Kaelin Academy in Canada and a very well-known civility campaigner. In fact, Diane and I spent time together co-hosting the world's first ever Global Civility Summit last October. Jackie Weatherall, the CEO of the City of Greater Dandenong, is joining us, as is Hannah Phillips from the Joe Cox Foundation in the UK. An extraordinary panel on a really timely topic: how councillors and staff are increasingly tackling the issues stemming from rising levels of negative, abusive, and sometimes threatening rhetoric. You don't want to miss it. Be part of the discussion. Tickets are free for VLGA members and alumni, or $60 for non-members, excluding GST. You can find all the details on the VLGA website on the events page, and we hope to see you there as part of that panel next Thursday from 5:30 p.m. That's all we have for you this week on VLGA Connect. We've got some terrific guests lined up over the next few weeks. Look forward to telling you more about that on our next edition, which will come your way next Friday. But for now, that's all from VLGA Connect, with our thanks to Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. We'll see you again soon.